In the summer of 1957, a station wagon lined up next to a Corvette at a stoplight in Detroit. And when the light turned green, the wagon won. Not by a little. It walked away. The man behind the wheel of the Corvette rolled down his window at the next light just to ask what he was driving, because nothing about that car looked like it should have been able to do what it just did. That wagon was carrying a factory supercharger that almost nobody knew existed, bolted on by a company that was 2 years away from disappearing forever. This is not an isolated story. Between 1954 and 1958, 4 different American car companies, all of them either dying or desperate, reached for the exact same piece of hardware and used it to build 7 cars that outran machines twice their price. Then every single one of those companies vanished, and the cars vanished with them. Almost nobody remembers this ever happened. By the end of this video, you will understand why a family sedan could out-accelerate a sports car, why one of these vehicles was built in a single day and never repeated, and why the fastest car one legendary brand ever produced was also the very last car it ever made. Stay with me, because car number 1 on this list sold for over $250,000 at auction, and it started life as a cheap performance option nobody wanted. Number 7. The Kaiser Manhattan, 1954 to 1955. To understand why this car exists, you have to understand how badly Kaiser Frazer was losing by the early 1950s. Right after World War II, Kaiser had actually looked like a real contender. Factories were desperate to build anything on wheels. Buyers were desperate to purchase anything with an engine. And for a few short years, Kaiser rode that wave right alongside the giants of Detroit. But by 1954, that window had slammed shut. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler were now rolling out modern overhead valve, Vate engines, lighter, stronger, and hungry for horsepower, numbers Kaiser could not touch. Kaiser was still building cars around a 226 cubic inch inline 6, a design so old it traced its lineage back to a Continental engine from years earlier. That engine made exactly 118 horsepower. In a market where horsepower had become the only number anyone talked about at the dealership, 118 was not a number. It was a confession. Kaiser did not have the money to design a new Vate from scratch. Building an entirely new engine family required tooling investment that a company already bleeding cash simply could not raise. So instead of surrendering, Kaiser's engineers went looking for a man named Robert Paxton McCulloch, a Stanford-trained engineer who had spent nearly 2 decades quietly perfecting a compact centrifugal supercharger in relative obscurity. His unit, known as the V57, was almost stupidly simple by the standards of forced induction at the time. Belt driven off the crankshaft, it built boost progressively as engine speed climbed past 3,000 RPM, and it was compact enough and reliable enough to be bolted directly onto an existing production engine without a total redesign. Kaiser fitted it to their aging 6, dialed the boost down to a cautious 4 pounds per square inch, purely for reliability, and watched horsepower jump from 118 to 140. On paper, that sounds unimpressive next to the Vates flooding showrooms that year, but Kaiser was never trying to win a horsepower war it had already lost. It was trying to buy one more year of relevance. The marketing leaned hard into that idea, selling the supercharged Manhattan as 2 engines in one. Quiet economy when you wanted it, and sudden energy the moment your foot went down. 0 to 60 dropped from a sluggish 17.5 seconds down to around 15 with the manual gearbox. A real and noticeable improvement for anyone who actually drove the thing. Every engine that left the factory was inspected component by component before installation, which, almost accidentally, made these some of the most carefully built engines Kaiser ever produced. Several thousand supercharged Manhattans rolled off the line before Kaiser shut down its entire American passenger car operation in 1955. The Supercharger did not save the company. Nothing was going to save the company at that point, but it quietly handed Kaiser a title that no other American manufacturer could claim in 1954. The first post-war domestic production car to offer a factory-installed supercharger as standard equipment. A footnote in most history books, but a footnote Kaiser genuinely earned. And if you think a supercharged station wagon sounds strange, wait until you hear what a supercharged luxury brand looks like when it has nothing left to sell, but somebody else's car with its own name stapled on top. Number 6. The 1957 Packard Clipper. Before the war, saying you drove a Packard meant something specific. It sat in the same conversation as Cadillac and Rolls-Royce, a name wealthy Americans genuinely aspired to own. backed by an advertising slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," that is still quoted by historians today. But by the middle of the 1950s, the company behind that name was in financial freefall. Studebaker Packard Corporation was drowning in debt, and to survive, production of every remaining Packard model was consolidated into the Studebaker factory in South Bend, Indiana. Packard was no longer designing its own automobiles. The new 1957 Packard was, underneath the badge, essentially a Studebaker President with a reworked front end, extra chrome trim, and a Packard emblem attached before it rolled onto the showroom floor. Critics at the time nicknamed it the Packard Baker, and there was no real argument to make against that name. It was accurate. And yet, embarrassing origin story aside, every single one of the 4,809 Packard Clippers built that year came equipped with a genuinely serious piece of engineering. A Studebaker 289 cubic inch Vate fitted from the factory with a McCulloch V57 supercharger, producing 275 horsepower at 4,800 RPM. There was no naturally aspirated option, no alternative engine to choose. If you bought a 1957 Packard Clipper, you got the blown Vate, whether you asked for it or not. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about when this car comes up. Of those 4,809 units, 869 of them were the country sedan station wagon, a 7-passenger family hauler loaded down with chrome trim and enough cargo space for a full weekend's luggage, and every single one of them carried 275 supercharged horsepower under that long hood. That made it quietly and almost invisibly one of the fastest station wagons on American roads in 1957, capable of humiliating sports cars at stoplights while carrying groceries in the back. Automotive historian Richard Langworth later summed the whole car up in a single line, writing that while these were not true Packards, they were nonetheless very good Studebakers, which is probably the most honest compliment a Packard baker was ever going to receive. That car was fast because a dying luxury brand had nothing left to lose. The next one on this list was fast for the exact opposite reason, because for one final year its maker refused to admit it was already losing. Number 5. The 1958 Studebaker Golden Hawk. 1958 was a brutal year for the entire American auto industry. The country was in a genuine recession, and sales collapsed across the board. Hard enough that even General Motors was losing tens of thousands of orders it had budgeted for. Studebaker, already the weakest of the independent automakers, got hit harder than almost anyone. Plants ran at reduced capacity. Budgets tightened everywhere. The long-term future of the entire company was growing murkier by the month, and everyone on the factory floor knew it. And yet, in the middle of all that collapse, the 1958 Golden Hawk kept rolling off the line completely unbothered, carrying the exact same supercharged 289 cubic inch Vate, producing 275 horsepower that it had carried the year before. Nothing about the formula changed in any meaningful way. It was still fast. It was still one of the most striking designs Studebaker had ever put into production. The problem was that almost nobody was buying it anymore. Only 878 units left the factory in 1958, compared to 4,356 built just 1 year earlier. That number alone tells you everything you need to know about where the company was headed. After 1958, the Golden Hawk nameplate was quietly retired, disappearing from the catalog without so much as a formal announcement. What makes that genuinely sad is that the car's shape, sculpted under the influence of the Raymond Loewy School of Industrial Design, remains one of the cleanest and most proportionally confident designs Studebaker ever produced. Looking at a 1958 Golden Hawk today, it is almost impossible to believe it came from a company that was financially on its knees at the moment it was built. The car carries itself with the confidence of a brand at the absolute top of its game, even though the reality behind the scenes was the exact opposite. The 1958 market simply did not care, and the Golden Hawk paid the price for that indifference with its own quiet disappearance. But rewind just 1 year earlier, and you find the version of this same car that did not just survive, it actively humiliated some of the most respected performance machines in America. Number 4. The 1957 Studebaker Golden Hawk. In 1956, the Golden Hawk had been running a borrowed Packard 352 cubic inch Vate producing 275 horsepower, which was more than enough to make it one of the genuinely fastest cars sold in America that year. In real-world magazine road tests, it beat the Corvette, it beat the Thunderbird, it beat the Chrysler 300B in a straight line. Studebaker had every reason to be proud of that car, right up until 1957, when the Packard engine plant closed permanently, and every plan built around that engine collapsed overnight. Studebaker was forced to replace it with the largest engine. The company actually owned outright a 289 cubic inch Vate that produced only 225 horsepower in naturally aspirated form, exactly 50 horsepower short of the year before. In the automotive business of the 1950s, a 50 horsepower gap on your flagship performance model was not something you could quietly paper over with marketing copy. Studebaker's answer was to bolt a McCulloch V57 supercharger directly onto that 289. Drop the compression ratio down to 7.8 to 1 to keep detonation under control, and cap boost at a conservative 5 pounds per square inch. The goal was never chasing a single peak horsepower number. It was broadening the torque curve across the entire RPM range so the car felt strong and responsive the instant you touched the throttle in real driving conditions, not just on a dyno chart. The result was 275 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 333 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPM. Numbers that match the outgoing Packard Vate almost exactly. The automotive press noticed immediately. At 0.95 horsepower per cubic inch. This was one of the highest specific output ratios of any mass-production American car sold that year. Both Road and Track and Motor Trend placed it among the fastest cars an ordinary buyer could purchase with ordinary money. The 1957 Golden Hawk did not just hold its ground against its predecessor. By several technical measures, it actually came out ahead of it. 4,356 units were built that year, and every single one of them came with that supercharger installed as standard equipment at absolutely no extra cost to the buyer. A piece of engineering Studebaker never marketed nearly aggressively enough for how genuinely clever it actually was. Now here is where this story stops being about desperate companies trying to survive and starts being about a giant that already had everything and still wanted more. Number 3. The 1957 Ford Fairlane F-Code. Ford did not build one supercharged car in 1957. It quietly built one of the rarest factory performance programs in American automotive history, and it did almost all of it because of NASCAR. To get a supercharged engine approved for competition, NASCAR's rules required that the exact same engine appear on enough production cars for ordinary buyers to actually purchase one, rather than restrict that engine to a single low-volume model. Ford advertised the F-Code as available across nearly the entire lineup, including the Fairlane, which at the time was a mass-market family car selling close to 800,000 units a year. The Fairlane F-Code ran a 312 cubic inch Vate paired with a Paxton VR57 supercharger, good for 300 horsepower, with compression held at a modest 8.5 to 1, so the car could run on ordinary pump gasoline without needing special fuel or careful tuning. That was, by a wide margin, the most powerful engine Ford sold to the public that year, sitting quietly under the hood of a family sedan that your own neighbor might have parked next to at the grocery store without either one of you having any idea what was actually under that hood. The rarest configuration in the entire F-Code lineup was the Skyliner, the model equipped with Ford's fully retractable metal hardtop roof, one of the most mechanically ambitious features Detroit had attempted on a consumer car up to that point. Combine that complicated retracting roof mechanism with the supercharged F-Code engine, and fewer than 20 are estimated to have ever been built in that exact configuration. Finding one intact today is close to impossible. Total Fairlane production that year reached 785,886 units. The F-Code cars were an almost invisible fraction of that number, barely traceable in Ford's own production records. The Thunderbird version of this engine tends to get all the collector attention today because of the name attached to it. But the Fairlane F-Code is arguably the more interesting story because it shows exactly how Ford actually deployed this supercharger program into the real world, hidden inside an ordinary family car that nobody was watching. And speaking of the Thunderbird, this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because Ford was not just building supercharged cars for buyers, it was hand-assembling them in a single day for one specific purpose. And that purpose got banned before a single one of them ever got to prove itself. Number 2, the 1957 Ford Thunderbird F-Code. This story starts and ends with NASCAR. In 1957, Ford wanted to dominate the racing circuit with a new supercharged engine package, but before that engine could be approved for competition, it needed to exist on enough production cars for the general public to buy. Robert McNamara, then head of Ford's car division, originally proposed a minimum production run of 100 qualifying units. The final mandate that came down called for 65 Ford custom two-door sedans, 20 convertibles, and 15 Thunderbirds, every single one fitted with the supercharged engine. All 15 of those Thunderbirds, known to collectors today as the Phase 1DF cars, were hand-assembled at Ford's Dearborn plant in a single day, January 25, 1957, never to be repeated in that exact configuration again. Each one left the factory with a 312 cubic inch V8, fitted with a McCulloch VR57 Phase 1 supercharger, a heavy-duty 3-speed manual transmission, seatbelts, and a fiberglass hardtop, completely stripped of unnecessary chrome and comfort features anywhere on the car, because these 15 vehicles existed for exactly one purpose, and they delivered on it immediately. At Daytona Speed Week in 1957, a Phase 1 Thunderbird set a new American sports car speed record at 138.755 miles per hour, 6 miles per hour faster than the previous year's record. That was more than enough for Ford's engineers to believe they were sitting on something genuinely dominant. After that initial batch, Ford rolled the F-code out as a real production option available to ordinary buyers. The street version used a Paxton VR57 supercharger on the same 312 cubic inch V8, rated at 300 horsepower in street trim and 340 horsepower in full race configuration. This was never a simple case of bolting a blower on top of a stock engine and calling it finished. The F-code package arrived with a heavy-duty radiator, high-performance cylinder heads, reinforced internal engine components, and a specially ground camshaft built specifically to handle the added stress of forced induction. Out of the 21,380 Thunderbirds built that year, only around 200 were true F-code cars, a genuinely tiny fraction of total production. The original sticker price sat around $4,815. Clean surviving examples today regularly clear 6 figures at auction, and the 15 original Phase 1 cars exist in a completely different collector universe altogether, with one selling in 2011 for $260,000. But here is where this entire story turns bitter without warning. NASCAR banned the Supercharger entirely early in 1957, before any of these cars ever competed in a single official sanctioned race. Shortly after, the Automobile Manufacturers Association issued a blanket ban on factory-supported racing across the entire industry, and Ford had no legal path left except to shut the whole program down. Every dollar of engineering, every one of those 15 hand-built cars, the Daytona speed record itself, all of it instantly became the story of something that should have happened and never got the chance to. Of the original 15 Phase 1 Thunderbirds built on that single day in January, only 8 are known to still exist today. If you thought that story was bitter, wait until you see what happened to the very last car ever built under the Packard name. Because this next one did not just vanish, it took an entire 60-year-old American legacy down with it. Number 1. The 1958 Packard Hawk. This is the last car that was ever allowed to carry the Packard name, and it is also, without argument, the fastest Packard the company ever built. To understand why that matters, you have to understand exactly who Packard used to be. Before World War II, Packard was the American luxury car wealthy buyers genuinely dreamed of owning. Mentioned in the same breath as Cadillac and Lincoln at the very top of the domestic market, and regularly compared directly to Rolls-Royce in conversations about the finest automobiles in the entire world. Their advertising slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," remains one of the most quoted lines in the history of American car marketing. But by 1958, Packard was no longer Packard in any meaningful sense. The brand had spent its final years putting its own badge on cars built at the Studebaker plant in South Bend and selling them as genuine Packards. The 1958 Packard Hawk was built directly on the Studebaker Golden Hawk platform underneath, but designer Duncan McRae did enough work to genuinely set it apart visually from its Studebaker sibling. The nose was completely reskinned in fiberglass with an entirely new grille treatment unique to this car. The trunk lid featured a sculpted spare tire impression, a styling choice that not everyone loved at the time, but that nobody could ever accuse of being timid or forgettable. Inside, the cabin was finished entirely in leather, with upholstery that rolled up and over the top edges of the door panels, a detail deliberately borrowed from high-end aircraft and custom boat interiors of the era, to signal genuine exclusivity. The instrument panel included a full tachometer alongside dedicated boost and vacuum gauges, letting the driver monitor exactly what that supercharger was doing at any given moment. A level of detail most cars in this price range never bothered offering. Packard's own advertising called it the most exclusive car in America, and at $3,995, that claim was not entirely dishonest. Under that reworked hood sat a Studebaker, 289 cubic inch Vate fitted with a McCulloch supercharger producing 275 horsepower and 333 foot-pounds of torque, capable of 0 to 60 in under 9 seconds, and a top speed around 125 miles per hour. Numbers that put the Hawk among the genuinely quickest cars available to American buyers anywhere in 1958. Most of the 588 units built came equipped with the Borg-Warner Flight-O-Matic automatic transmission, but roughly 28 of them were special ordered with the T85 3-speed manual and overdrive, and those manual-equipped cars are now the single most sought-after Packard Hawks in the entire collector world. When one of those comes up for sale, it does not stay on the market long. Packard ceased production entirely on July 13, 1958. Those 588 Hawks were the very last thing left of a 60-year-old brand that had once quietly defined what American luxury actually meant for decades. The 1958 Packard Hawk was not a perfect car by any honest measure. It wore a borrowed body over a borrowed engine, carrying a name that was actively disappearing while it was still being built. But everyone who actually drove one in 1958 knew exactly what they had. Something genuinely fast, genuinely well-made, and something that the world was never, under any circumstances, going to build again. Look back across all 7 of these cars, and one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Not a single one of these companies chose a supercharger because they wanted to. Kaiser used it because they could not afford to build a real Vate. Studebaker used it because their engine supplier disappeared overnight. Ford used it to qualify for NASCAR, then watched it get banned before a single race. Packard used it because there was genuinely nothing else left to build with. Every one of these vehicles that just beat a faster, more expensive, more respected car at a stoplight in 1957 or 1958 came from a company that was already dying while it built them. The entire era of the McCulloch supercharger on American production cars lasted exactly 4 model years, from 1954 to 1958. Then NASCAR banned it. The AMA Pact killed factory-backed racing across the entire industry, and one by one, every single brand that had relied on that supercharger to survive faded away completely. So here's the question. Out of everything you just heard, if you could only keep one of these 7 cars in your own garage, which one are you taking home? The 1957 Thunderbird F code that set a Daytona record before getting banned? Or the 1958 Packard Hawk that closed out an entire 60-year legacy in a single blaze of speed? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know. And if this kept you watching until the very last second, that alone tells me you need to see what these companies were building just 1 year before all of this collapsed. So hit subscribe before you go, because the next one might be even harder to believe.